recorder, and that's it. And then I've got
All
to
right.
pick.
I think I'm recording. We'll see. We'll have to just see how it goes. But I'm going to start anyways, and I'll start. Anyway, so Ralph Epperson is my guest. Ralph Epperson is a longtime author. He's a professor at, I believe, Arizona State University. Is that right? Is that right, Ralph?
No, let's clear that up. No, I'm not a professor at Arizona or Arizona State. I taught part-time at Mount Hood Community College.
Okay.
And so you could call me a professor, but that was years ago.
Okay. And you're the author of a whole list of books, including New World Order and other books you've done. You have a great history of study of alternative history, particularly of the United States and the founding of the Republic and all the way back. And you have a great deal to say about what, in a sense, led to the nature of what we call euphemistically the Eastern Seaboard liberal establishment, and who they are and how they operate and why they operate the way they do.
Yes, I believe that's true. Thank you. If I may, let's just start with this. There is a connection between the American Revolution, the War of 1816, and the Civil War. They're all connected because there was a desire of the European bankers to create a central bank in the United States. If that's the subject you want to discuss, let's get into it. I'll be happy to share.
Let's do it. Let's do it. So we're talking about the long battle between the development of the central bank, which started with the Bank of England in Europe, and in a sense, government currency. And it's a battle in the United States that goes back to before the founding of the Republic. It goes back to the chartering, I believe, of the Bank of England, and my research tells me, which was in 1798, around that time, or 1698, and that the Bank of England. And now I have a quote in my book, and I don't know if you can confirm this, Ralph, but that the Benjamin Franklin went to England, and the Parliament. He had a meeting with the Parliament, and they said, "How do you explain why the American colonies are so prosperous?" And he said, "It's because we have our own money." And basically back then, the colonies printed their own money, starting with Massachusetts, I may add, my own home state, where they had government-issued currency, what they called scrip, and that the government would charge a very tiny interest rate. The profit from that would go toward improving the infrastructure. That's how they built the street lamps in Boston. But it was very low interest loans to farmers, to small businessmen, to people who would have a means to propose the ability to pay it back. And that's how currency was issued into the economy. It was basically virtual credit free, and it was done by fiat by the colony, by the Bay Colony, backed by the good faith and credit of the Bay Colony. And other colonies began to do this as well. I mean, Maryland and Virginia used tobacco to back their currency. In fact, if you go to the Maryland State House today in Annapolis, you'll see on the grounds a counting house for tobacco. It was used as collateral by farmers to get loans from the Bank of Maryland, and thus currency was issued by the colony at very low interest rates, and the colony prospered. And when the Parliament heard Franklin describe this, they said, "This is terrible. We have to do something about this." And what they implemented was Bank of England notes on the American colonies at interest. And they made that the only legal tender, and they banned scrip. And the result was a depression for the first time in the colonies. And this played a major role in leading to the American Revolution. Am I onto something with that?
Well, yeah, yeah, right. I believe. Yeah, I don't know much about what you just said, because I have a little different explanation. The reason we declared our independence had nothing to do with the banks; it had everything to do with the Declaratory Act of 1766. Have you discovered that yet?
That's what I'm talking about. The Declaratory Act of 1766 made only Bank of England notes, which were fiat notes issued by the Bank of England as legal tender in all 13 colonies.
Well, okay. At the bottom of that declaratory act, it talked about the Parliament issuing the power to legislate in all cases whatsoever, to
Correct.
bind down the people and the states in America. And it was the power to legislate in all cases whatsoever. So we lived under that declaratory act for 10 years. And in 1776, we declared our, I'm sorry,
Okay.
I'm getting an echo. Now, yeah, we're not doing very well. There's
No, the technology, neither of us are great technicians here, but we shall forge forward as best we can.
Because this is the key. I don't care about whether the Bank of England had notes or not. I'm telling you what they did to this country because of the power of the Declaration of the Declaratory Act. That's what I want to get to. And then to show you that okay, if I may just finish with this. In the Declaration of Independence, at the bottom of the second paragraph, it talks about the King of George having the power to create a absolute tyranny over these states. And when he did that, we declared our independence. In the Declaration of Independence, it says that they actually cited the provision of the power to legislate in all cases whatsoever. So they said, that's the reason we're declaring our independence. And after they did that, 11 years later, they created the Constitution. And in the Constitution, they gave them the power to legislate in all cases whatsoever. In other words, our founding fathers gave Congress total unlimited power in the Constitution. That's far more important than whether the Bank of England, in my mind, has banknotes or not. Do you understand? Congress knows it's got the power to legislate in all cases whatsoever, granted to them by the founding fathers in the Constitution.
Right. Well,
now, we could cover.
Wasn't that a reassertion of sovereignty against this act by England, which put the Bank of England as sole controller of the issuance of currency in the Americas? And one of the first acts, my understanding, by the Second Continental Congress, when they, I think it's even before the Declaration of Independence, was to declare a currency, what's called the Continental Scrip. And what the British responded to that with a full-scale invasion, which was what the American Revolution was, and they began to issue counterfeit currency. That's why the Continental became valueless, because they were literally sending out buckets of counterfeits out of New York to debauch the American currency. And so a lot of the struggle right there was who got to control the issuance of currency, which is really a huge power. I mean, it's the power to control people and people's property and destiny. And I think that ever since then, there has been a struggle between the central bank idea, which is that the currency would be issued by private bankers, whether it be called the Second Bank of the United States or the Federal Reserve, as opposed to a direct issuance by the government through the U.S. Treasury Department based upon the economy, based upon what is required. And that was a struggle that has taken place in almost every presidency, right up till today. And it's something that used to be openly debated, but the debate over that kind of stopped with the establishment of the Federal Reserve in 1913. And since then, we don't even discuss this. It's all that the central bankers at the Fed get to decide the issuance of currency, not the federal government, not the Treasury, which is how it used to be done.
Well, 1791, George Washington listened to Alexander Hamilton and created the first bank of the United States.
That's right.
Okay. And then they had the power to issue money. And the purpose was to create a central bank and they decided not to make it permanent. They made it run for only 20 years.
Right.
1791 to 1811.
That's
Now,
right.
in Monroe made sure it was not renewed. So in 1812, we had the War of with 1812 with England once again to create debt on the United States, who had very little taxing power. So they decided then to create the second Bank of the United States in 1816 to run until 1836. Andrew Jackson ran on a very simple platform: bank and no bank, or bank and no Jackson, or Jackson and no bank. And the American people overwhelmingly said, we don't want a central bank, and Jackson won in a landslide. Now, but I want to point out to you what Jefferson tried to warn us with. I'll read the exact quote. It is incumbent on every generation to pay its own debts as it goes, a principle which, if acted upon, would save 1/2 of the wars of the world. Bankers love wars, and they'll create wars to loan money to central banks. Well, if you don't have a central bank, then they're stuck. They've got some other way to do it. And then they planned in 1837, creating the Knights of the Golden Circle to force us into a civil war. They couldn't get their own forces to fight it because America was building a navy to protect the shores, and England would have to send over a 3,000-mile ocean, would have to send their ships to supply their troops if they sent a war against the United States. So they decided to split the United States into a North and a South. And then they could fund both sides of the war. Now, the second part, Lincoln decided not to borrow the money. He created the greenback dollar, and he saved us trillions of dollars of interest.
No, I think you and I are on the same page, Ralph, in terms of the history of this. The first bank established by Hamilton, it actually was not the same thing as the Fed. My understanding is it wasn't totally privately owned. It was mostly owned by the government, but nevertheless, it was still a move toward this private banking. And when the charter expired, you had the British invasion of the War of 1812. Madison was forced to create a second bank, and as a way to stop that war. And Madison was very much against the bank. And then Jackson came along 20 years later and he didn't recharter it and let it expire. And he gave some fantastic fiery speeches about this, and how it's a serpent that's going to strangle us, and it's a viper, I think he referred to it as, and that Jackson led to the destruction of the second bank. He was the only president in American history and the only modern leader of any nation state in modern history to completely balance the budget. It led to a golden age of American currency that went all the way from 1836 right up to the founding of the Federal Reserve in 1913. And that Lincoln was being coerced by central bankers to create a bank. He did not do so. He instead issued greenbacks directly from the Treasury, interest-free, to pay for the war, and he was assassinated. And we could go through some other situations where the central bankers tried to monopolize gold, and they tried to tie the currency to specie, which is not really, it's very questionable in terms of how a currency ought to operate. But however it happened, I mean, the Federal Reserve was established in 1913, and America then again went to war. And I think that you can make the case, and anyone who studies the history, for example, of how World War I got started, you can see that this central banking system was, and credit and usury and all the rest, that you had different central banks competing with each other, and that eventually they put their nations into deep debt. And in order to pay back those debts, they had to exploit colonies and eventually go to war with each other. So, I think you can make the case that the whole system of private banking as a way for a nation to issue its own currency, which is insane, is the cause of war. It's the cause of debt. It's the cause of a loss of freedom. Now, I'm not saying that that means you shouldn't be able to borrow money, or the government shouldn't even be able to borrow money in certain situations, such as collateralized bonds and whatnot. But the fact is that the currency itself should be issued interest free. The government, the money, bankers can make money from interest loaning to businesses and people. You need to buy a home, you need to get a mortgage. Most people can't shell out that kind of money. I get that. That's part of the way the system works. But the money itself has to be interest free. The money itself you can't have bankers profiting off of the actual money itself. The money itself should be an interest free instrument of exchange issued by a government based upon the economy, based upon the national, domestic national product, and nothing more. It shouldn't be, when our government today creates currency, they go to the Federal Reserve and the Federal Reserve gives them money at interest. That's wrong. It doesn't make sense.
Well, yeah, there's a step that we glossed over, and that was the creation of the Knights of the Golden Circle.
Right.
England,
I understand that was something and that's been, you're onto something with that, because that along with certain radical elements of the abolitionist movement were part of a deliberate and conscious attempt to tear the United States apart. And I think that President Zachary Taylor stood up to it, and he was assassinated, I think. And I actually have a chapter in my book, Assassination in America, that gets into that one. And that's a really obvious one, in my opinion. But these organizations, these secret societies, were there to create disunion. They wanted to rip the United States apart and create a war so that both sides would go into hock to central bankers. I think that that's a case very well made.
Well, the Knights of the Golden Circle were created by European bankers who hired mercenaries to go to America and spread secession using slavery as an issue. The Civil War was not fought over, it was fought over slavery, but that wasn't the real reason. They knew they couldn't fight the war themselves, England and or French combined, because America was developing a navy and they couldn't supply their troops. And Mexico was too small and Canada was too small, so they couldn't use those. So they divided the states into the North and the South. And then they tried to get Lincoln to borrow the money to pay for the war. And Lincoln said, no, I'm going to issue the greenback dollar.
Right. And that's what led to his demise. And that was vilified afterwards.
And the reason it led to his demise because the Knights of the Golden Circle killed him. John Wilkes Booth was a member of the Knights. Yep. So was Edwin Stanton. That night, there were going to be 4 people assassinated. And if that happened, there was no secession law. And Edwin Stanton probably would have become president. And he was a member of the Knights of the Golden Circle.
Yeah, no, look, that's another one of the things that I also cover in my book, Assassination in America. Some of the aspects of the Lincoln assassination, which are not widely known. We still have the pressure from the central bankers to create, to further their power, to internationalize now. They have interlocking relationships all over the world. I don't know exactly what the deal is with China, whether they have a central bank or not. But, the European and American central bankers and the Anglo-American establishment, as it was talked about by Carroll Quigley in his book, Tragedy and Hope, is very much a move toward an informal, unofficial international governance through these bankers and their investors and their friends and their interlocking interests who are not elected, who are not loyal to any nation state, and who are internationalists and globalists. And they have continued to usurp sovereignty in this country and in other countries to our detriment and to the detriment of one of the most progressive and natural systems known to human civilization, and that is the development of the sovereign nation state. And so I guess what I want to know from you, Ralph, and I don't know if you have any data on this, but it seems to me that given the fact that these usurious internationalist peoples are largely responsible for the creation of 2 world wars and depressions and the Cold War, the whole structure. What do you think is their role in the present pandemic, if any?
Well, I don't know whether they're. Let's go back. You mentioned Quigley. Did you know that Quigley named 12 banking families that run the world?
And who are they?
Well, I'd have to go get the book. Let me say, I'll do it indirectly. He named them. They're families, not individuals, but families.
Sure. And so that's how central banking tends to work that way. I mean, it's, banking outfits, banking families, banking syndicates grow up and develop these networks.
There are 12 banking families, 4 of which I recognized after studying this for some 30 or 40 years. The other 8 I've never heard of, which means they're buried. But the Warburgs and the not even the Rothschilds, not the Rockefellers are not a banking family, but the Warburgs are. And I recognized the name Seligman because they were involved in the Civil War, and one other, and the other 8 I've never heard of. So they're not, and Quigley pointed out that they run the economies of the world through private secret meetings of the central bankers. And the bankers, as Jefferson warned us, plan wars. And then they create wars, fund both sides. As Quigley pointed out in the book, Tragino, America funded Hitler's army and development as well, and made enormous profits. The factories that were owned by American capitalists were not bombed by Roosevelt, the president, who was the one who decided which factories got bombed during World War II.
Well, first of all, I mean, my understanding is that the Rockefellers are or at least they were one of the major banking families. They got into banking. I mean, Chase Manhattan is a Rockefeller bank, and they had a lot of interest in Nazi Germany. They were, I.G. Farben and other companies. I mean, I think that it was the late Hoover Institute fellow Anthony Sutton wrote a tremendous book about this called Wall Street and the Nazis. He also wrote one, Wall Street and the Bolsheviks. Same basic dynamic. You had international banking families. The Harrimans are one of them, by the way, a very big one in the United States.
But they're not one of the 12.
That's right. The Harrimans, and Averell Harriman was a major internationalist, and that they basically helped finance the establishment of both Nazi Germany and Bolshevik Russia, with the idea that they would have command economies that these bankers could then take advantage of, and that it had everything to do with the creation of these wars. I want to make a little bit of a side disclaimer here, however, and I don't know where you are on this, Ralph, but this lends itself to the old European Jewish conspiracies, that this is somehow a plot by the Jews. Now, some of these families have Jewish names, and they very well may be Jewish. I think that would be the case with the Rothschilds. But it's nothing to do with Judaism, and it has nothing to do with any kind of organization of Jews. I really think I need to say that clearly, because to my way of thinking, that whole line of thinking is actually a distraction away from the real truth of this thing. You put up some big name people who happen to have Jewish backgrounds and say, you see, it's the Jews, and it takes the eye off the real ball here, which is that this is an internationalist, atheistic, amoral group, in fact, well described by Carroll Quigley in his book, Tragedy and Hope, that simply wants informal rule of the world there. Most of them happen to not be Jewish. A lot of them are English, actually. And that international banking or central banking really goes back to the Venetians and the great Bavarian German banking family of the Fuggers, who were Catholic. So it's not a Jewish thing. And usury isn't Jewish either. Anyway, what are your thoughts on that, Ralph?
In fact, I've been arguing against the Jewish conspiracy for 50 years.
Yeah.
Please, if I may, give me a few seconds to explain what this conspiracy is.
Sure.
It's 6,000 years old. And it basically involves a worship of Satan. And the people who are Jewish have to renounce their Jewish faith. If you're a Catholic and you want into this conspiracy, you have to renounce your Catholicism, and you've got to physically worship Satan. The Rothschilds and the Warburgs and the other 8 or 10 other banking families are all Luciferians.
Well, look, I mean, I don't doubt that. I don't know exactly what they believe.
In other words, they want us to throw, you're right. The reason they come up with a Jewish conspiracy is to throw us off the track. And I'll give you a good example. They say, I want to talk to you about this conspiracy. Oh yeah, I've heard about that. You're right. You say you're right. It's you say it's the Jews. I say, no, I don't. No, yes, you do. And they walk away and they won't listen to the evidence. It's 6,000 years old and directly under the control of Satan, Lucifer, the devil. Provable. It's called the Great White Brotherhood. There's 9 of them. They run the world and have for 6,000 years. They passed out generation to generation, but they're the ones in charge. The Rothschilds are not in charge. The Warburgs, the Rockefellers, the other 9 or 10 banking families, they're not in charge. If you know anything about the Knights Templars went to Jerusalem and convinced the king or the lord or mayor, wherever it is, to house their horses under the remains, the floor level in Solomon's stables. And then they started digging and found an enormous wealth of the Jews and brought it out and took it to Europe, and they became the international bankers, loaning money to governments and especially the Catholic Church.
No, I mean, I think that's a fascinating history. And I think that whether or not these people are active and conscious Satanists, that I don't know. But what I'd say is this: they certainly, in the de facto sense, are satanic in their behavior, in that this, Satan, I mean, we could go back to the Garden of Eden. The serpent, which represents the forces of Satan, is the one that tempted Eve to partake of the forbidden fruit and have the power overthrow God in heaven. I mean, become like know all good and evil, to the tree of knowledge. And that was the conspiracy of Satan. And then, of course, when she involved Adam in the conspiracy, then it became a conspiracy, because you need 2 or more people to conspire, and they conspired against God. So ever since then, in a de facto sense, we have an element within human civilizations in every generation that is part of this conspiring against God and creating a human paradise on earth where man would overthrow God and know all things, good and evil. Man would become God. That's what the communist movement's about. That's what the Nazi movement was about. And, whether or not the international bankers are consciously a part of that, I have no idea. We can't know. They're secretive. But their actions and their behaviors and their use of that kind of power is the manifestation of it. It is true in the de facto sense.
Well, it's not true. I don't know what the de facto means. I'm telling you, the Knights of the Golden Circle, the Great White Brotherhood is real. We know where they exist. I've got the names. I can prove that 6,000 years old. I can also prove they're directly under the control of Lucifer, because you're right. Satan was kicked out of heaven when Satan tried to take over and replace the God of the Bible, right? And there was a war, and Satan was expelled to the Garden of Eden. Adam, you're right. God created Adam and Eve and taught them not to eat from the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, which means I will teach you morality. You're not to decide for yourself. And Satan said to Eve first, no, you should eat from the tree, and then ye shall be as gods, knowing good or evil. She convinced Adam, and God banished them. Right?
Exactly.
And
Exactly.
now, whether or not we believe that, or the Catholics, the Jews, or anyone believes that, that's what this conspiracy believes. And they've,
Well, whether we believe it or not, and I do believe it with perfect faith, but putting that aside for a second for argument, that is the manifestation of what we're looking at. We look at a group of people, an elite group who believe that they know better than the rest of us how we should conduct our lives. They can define reality. They can define morality in their image, however they want, because they act like they are gods. So whether or not they believe it, it's not even all that relevant. We can't know that. The point is that that's what they're doing.
Each man in the New World Order that's coming, that they created, and by the way, our founding fathers set this nation on the course of creating of the New World Order. The world, everyone in the world will be free to decide for themselves, just like Adam and Eve believed Satan. When we will have the power to decide what's right, wrong. Every one of us, there'll be no God telling us what to do or not to do. That's the New World Order, and that's why they intended to bring it on. We didn't talk about this from the beginning. We talked about the Federal Reserve, but it's all connected. The purpose of the New World Order is to free man from God and morality. I just proved it in about a 20-minute DVD that Charles Darwin admitted in his own book, Origin of Species, that evolution is totally false. Darwin.
And I mean, Ralph, I also wrote a book on this topic called The Apostles of Evolution, and that terrible theory is, the implementation of scientific racism in the world. But I will differ with you slightly, only in that while I don't believe that our founding generation and our founding fathers are, by far from perfect people. I mean, there's a lot of, we shouldn't venerate them. Nevertheless, my overall understanding is that they were good, believing Christians. And that they were, maybe I'm wrong here, but that's my study. And that includes Washington and Jefferson and Adams and Madison and the whole group of them. And that they were interested in creating a limited government, a republic, which is why they implemented the world's first constitution that has survived.
I already covered that when I said that they gave Congress all power in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 17 of the Constitution, the power to legislate in all cases whatsoever. I don't know if you can see
the Bill of Rights limits that power. Articles 9 and 10 of the Bill of Rights.
Article 1, Section 8 gives Congress total unlimited power to pass whatever laws they want to.
Please. Yeah, but wait a minute, Ralph. I don't mean to dispute here, but I think also Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution then goes through very careful clauses where it tells, it says where Congress can legislate. It just isn't all powerful. I mean, it says this is what you can do on trade, this is what you can do on currency, this is what you can do on war. I mean, it goes through each clause of the kind. That's what the whole body of Article 1, Section 8 is. Yeah. And then you have the Bill of Rights, Articles 9 and 10,
Charles,
which say that all powers that are not specifically delegated to the U.S., the federal government and Congress, shall reside with the states and with the people.
Charles, please let me read Article 1, Section 8, Clause 17. I don't know if you can see me. I've got it in my hands.
All right. Go ahead.
We're going to read. The Congress shall have power, Article 1, Section 8. And then we go down through the listed delegated powers to number 17. Article 1, Section 8, Clause 17, quote, Congress shall have the power to exercise exclusive legislation in all cases whatsoever. Period. Huh? What did you just say, Ralph? The power to legislate in all cases whatsoever. The very same words used by King the Parliament to give King George the power to legislate in all cases whatsoever. And the very same words are used in the Declaration of Independence that King George was using the power to legislate in all cases whatsoever. And that's the reason we declared our independence. We have been lied to. This was not taxation without representation. It was the power to legislate in all cases whatsoever. Now, why did Congress give them, the founders give them that power in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 17, unless they wanted to do it? Please.
The only thing I'd add to that, and I have to study this, I'm not a constitutional scholar, but I'm going to look into it, is that why then did the Article 1, Section 8, before getting to that clause, list all these other clauses which limit congressional power?
I would urge you to read the Federalist Papers because, forgive me, I just, I'll let it ring one more time, then it'll end. That's my phone ringing, just a wave. Please, in the Federalist Papers, Madison explained what I just covered.
Okay.
He said people are dumb enough to believe that under the General Welfare Clause, we have unlimited power. No, we don't. It's in the power to legislate in all cases whatsoever. You can read that in the Federalist Papers. The man who wrote Article 1, Section 8, Clause 17, Madison admitted that's where the power is unlimited. He admitted it. He's the one that wrote it. Okay, so we got that straight now. Article 1. Now, let's go back to
study it. Yep, go on.
Okay, let's go back to the beginning of this thing. Back in the Great Seal of the United States, on the left-hand side, the pyramid side, the Latin phrase reads annuit septis above the pyramid, and then novus ordo seclorum underneath the pyramid, right?
Sure. Mm-hmm.
Annuit, announcing, or the announcement of, septis, the conception of, announcing the birth of, the novus, new, ordo, order, seclorum, world, announcing the birth of the new world order in 1776. Notice it's the birth. It's not an adult. It's the baby. We announced it and we're creating it. We're committing this nation to the New World Order. These great men of great wisdom, and then they gave Congress total unlimited power. It doesn't matter about the other 17 or the Ninth Amendment because they've got all power. Let me give you one specific instance to prove this. Just a matter of weeks ago, little Nancy Pelosi, the Congress under the Constitution was given the power to impeach a president. They have to develop charges, and then those charges are to be typed up or prepared and then walked across the other end of the building and given to the Senate. And the Senate then has the power to read those charges, determine whether they're valid, and then if so, they will remove the president. The power to impeach is in the House and the power to remove is in the Senate. And let me tell you what happened. You might remember this. Little Nancy Pelosi, as soon as the charges were delivered, tried to tell the Senate what she wanted in demands. I want more personal interviews. I want more men called. I want you to submit them to us to make sure that we agree to it. She doesn't have that power unless she knows they've got the power to legislate in all cases whatsoever. I'm trying to get you. I know this is revolutionary. It's maybe strange to you.
No, not at all. I followed that very carefully. And what I would say was that Nancy Pelosi was overstepping the power of the House, and she was reprimanded and was challenged by the Senate. Who said, no, you don't have that power.
Nancy Pelosi, the Supreme Court, and our senators all know about Article 1, Section 8, Clause 17. I wish we could talk about that and all.
Talk about it, Ralph, but I would simply point out that the illustration you just made gets into how the very root of the Constitution and the entire system of government, not to mention an examination of nature itself and the way people live their lives, is that power is balanced and checks and balances are in place. So if you have a Nancy Pelosi who's claiming greater power than we conventionally think she has as the Speaker of the House. That was challenged by and checked by the U.S. Senate, which said, no, you don't have that power. That's why we have different branches of government. I mean, that's why the Article 1, Section 8 deals with Congress, but then you have Article 2, which is the executive clause, and Article 3, which is the judicial clause. So the thing is that all of these powers, which are enormous, are balanced by the other powers, are checked by the other powers. And then they're all checked by the states. And then within the states replicate the federal powers with their own constitutions, their own governors, and their own legislators. And those powers are checked by each other and by the cities and towns. So, I mean, we have a system that checks and separates and essentially silos power so that power is pitted against each other.
Do you know anything about the Erie Railroad versus Tompkins decision of 1938 Supreme Court?
I think, didn't that allow for interstate?
No.
I'm not all that familiar with that one. No.
You're not going to like this what I'm about to tell you, but I'm trying to tell you, and unfortunately, you're arguing and that's your purpose. You're supposed to do that, but I wish you'd listen to me.
I am listening to you, Ralph.
Because
I'm not supposed to do anything. I think on my own. But anyway, go on.
The Constitution was overturned by the Erie Railroad versus Tompkins case of 1938. You want proof? Read it yourself.
I will read it. I will, and I respect the fact that I've heard that said about various Supreme Court cases as well.
No, this is the only one. We don't have a constitution anymore. We're living under the Uniform Commercial Code. Have you ever heard about that? Please.
Vaguely. I don't know much about that. I mean, interstate. I know that the Constitution does essentially create a free trade zone between the states.
Please understand, it's over. It doesn't exist anymore. I'm living proof of that.
How so?
My license plate is marked, do not check it. Because I know the Constitution and the common law is null and void.
Okay.
I'm trying to tell you, please, I know this is revolutionary to you, and that's why I thought I was invited. Maybe we could discuss this, and I could share some new ideas to you.
You are sharing new ideas, Ralph. Good. I'm not. I'm simply, challenging them, but that doesn't mean that I'm in no way am I impeding you from sharing your ideas.
Okay. Well, I've given you several sources. I've read from Article 1.
And I respect those sources, and I'll look into it further. I'm just.
Let me tell you this. You need to look into Howard Freeman. Who's
okay?
He's the man that discovered this truth.
I will look into him.
Probably 30 years ago. Let me tell you, can we spend a few minutes on what he discovered?
Sure, go right ahead.
Okay, let's go back. Freeman came to Tucson, Arizona. I lived there, and the man who brought him here was going to allow him to speak the next morning to a club that we were both members. And he said, Freeman's agreed on Friday night. He got here Friday. He's going to speak Saturday morning, then go back to wherever he's from. So he said, he's agreed to sit in the living room and talk. Please come on over, Ralph, and listen. I said, boy, I want to listen to Howard Freeman. So Freeman taught two little stories. I'll make them as brief as I can. A friend of his, a young friend, he said, had stopped filing income taxes because he believed he didn't have to.
Mm-hmm.
So he pled not guilty. And when the prosecution showed up, the IRS agent said we're records he showed from so many years, and then he stopped paying. So now there's no question he stopped paying. So
right.
Now he has a chance to defend himself, and he asked Howard Freeman to get up. And Howard Freeman he's now gone, was a constitutional expert. So he started by citing standing Supreme Court decisions that ruled we didn't have to pay income taxes. He listed 8 of them, one after the other. And when he got through, he went back to the young man's table and said, you're going to win. That's a federal judge. And that federal judge is obligated by the oath he took to support the Constitution of the United States and standing Supreme Court decisions. So now, the judge, as he is ready to dismiss, they're both sides have ended their argument. So the judge now talks to the jury and says, you are to completely disregard the testimony of Howard Freeman. Freeman said he can't do that. So let me finish. He left the table, ran around back, and caught the judge coming out of the back of the court to cross the hall into his office. And he caught him just as he was unlocking the door. And he said, Your Honor, yes, Mr. Freeman. He said, Your Honor, you're a federal judge. That's correct. You took an oath to support the Constitution. Yes, I did. And to support standing Supreme Court decisions. Yes, I did. Well, then what authority can you decide that those standing Supreme Court decisions are null and void? He said, because they all occurred prior to 1938. So Freeman said, what happened in 1938 to eliminate standing Supreme Court decisions? And the judge said, I told you too much. And he walked into the office, shut the door, and then locked it. In other words, I can't talk to you anymore. But Freeman knew how to check Supreme Court decisions. He's an expert. He went to the law library and looked and found the Erie Railroad versus Tompkins decision of the Supreme Court in October of 1938. And when he read it, he read the Constitution as null and void. Now, let me finish with part two. He later went on, I'm making this a lot longer than this. I'm making it as short as I can. But listen to this discussion. He got a phone call. He lives in Wyoming. And he got a phone call. Hi, are you Howard Freeman? Yes, sir. He said, I've been watching you. I want to talk to you. I'm a retired state Supreme Court justice. And I want to talk to you. So Freeman trundled over to his home and walked in the door and said, hi there, I'm Howard Freeman. Yes, I know, Mr. Freeman. Let me tell you, I am a retired state Supreme Court justice, but there was a time when I was a federal judge. And in 1938, all of us federal judges got calls to go back to Washington, D.C., where we were met and addressed by Franklin Roosevelt himself, 1938. And he said, Roosevelt said in a condensed form to all these people, these are all the judges, probably the attorney generals and the staff on the bureau, and the bureau departments, maybe 1,000 of them. And they said, Roosevelt said, you might remember that in 1933, I called in all the gold. He didn't have the power to do that. Those gold certificates said payable to the bearer on demand. There's no comma unless the president calls them in or, on demand. You walk in with a piece of paper and you walk out with gold that moment. But he rescinded that, and we could no longer own gold. And then Roosevelt said that was determined to be the action of a bankrupt nation, and the people that owned the national debt declared this nation bankrupt in 1933 or 38. And he said, they have decided to eliminate the Constitution, and we're going to live under the Uniform Commercial Code. And we are, the UCC. The Constitution is null and void. It doesn't. But then there's one more thing I want to say. The judge told him, please never repeat my name, or I could get into serious trouble. How could a judge talking about Supreme Court decisions get in powerful trouble because they took an oath to take silent judicial notice of that fact, which means you can't tell the dummies, meaning us, you've got to make it sound like it's a constitution, but rule under the Uniform Commercial Code. Now, there are those of us like me that have my license plate, my driver's license marked without prejudice, which means I'm getting your driver's license, but I'm reserving the right without prejudice to go back to the common law, the Constitution. So when I get in traffic tickets. I go to the judge and I get him to throw it out because there are no more common law courts. And the Constitution was the common law. Please, I'm asking you to look into this. You need to listen to Howard Freeman.
No, it's very interesting, Ralph. So then 1938, Erie Canal versus Tompkins.
Erie Railroad.
Erie Railroad versus Tompkins.
Now,
You said that suspended the Constitution.
Yeah.
I'll look into it. I mean, I'm not saying no to that. I mean, I don't, it's interesting.
this is going to
I
change.
just don't have enough knowledge right now to comment on it, but I just don't have Supreme Court decisions in front of me here. But
I want you to understand, this is all by design of our founding fathers. They knew what they were doing when they set this nation up to fail by putting us onto the New World Order, which was going to happen in the future. It would no longer be a child or a birth of it, it'll be adult. And that date was supposed to be the 1st of January, the year 2000, which meant 200 and some years later. They knew they had 200 years to soften this country, this nation up, to deliver it to the Novus Ordo Seclorum. They knew, our founding fathers knew, they were traitors to all of us. They gave Congress total unlimited power, and they know they got it right to this very day.
No, it's a troubling thought, Ralph. I mean, I'll look into the whether or not the Constitution was suspended in 1938. I on the surface, I can't go along with you on the founding fathers, but I respect your research, and I think that I think you make a case for that. I just
please, Charles, can you find a copy of the Declaration or the Constitution someplace in front of you? Please read it to me.
We already went over it. I will read it, after the show, and I'll talk to some people about it. I'm not discounting anything you've said. I just, to my way of thinking, it doesn't jive with me on the surface. But I'll look into it and I'll research it.
The reason it didn't jive with me until I found it. Please understand, I'm just like you. I've studied this thing for 50 years of my life.
And I respect that.
I don't say things I cannot prove. I just proved to you. Article 1, Section 8, Clause 17 gave them the very thing they objected to in the Declaration of Independence. And then I'll even give you the citation in the Federalist Papers where he admits that's the power to legislate, means all power.
Okay.
Madison said it's not the general welfare clause like a bunch of dummies believe. They're wrong. Something about how fraudulent their thoughts are. The power is in the power to declare, to legislate in all cases whatsoever. He's put it in writing in the Federalist Papers.
Now, where in the Federalist Papers is that?
Forgive me. I quickly say number 47, but please call me after and I'll source it for you. I'll tell you exactly.
Okay. I'll have to. I haven't read I've read in the Federalist Papers, but and I've seen a lot of things about. I think Madison spends a lot of time talking about the balance of powers. That was his genius contribution. But I'll look at this thing and I'll try to look at it in context, and I'll try to get us a handle of what he meant by it. I'll research that.
Charles,
Yes, Ralph.
May I suggest you write down America's Secret Destiny. And It's 4 hours. It'll cover this. It'll tell you how they did it, why they did it, and what secret destiny were we committed to.
Okay. All right. I haven't heard of that. I can look into it.
Please, and then call me and let's talk.
Okay, Ralph. All right. Ralph Epperson, I'm kind of toward the end of the program, so can you let my listeners and viewers know where they can get your books and get more information about your work?
If you want to, by the way, I would urge all of your listeners, by the way, let's do it first. Let's talk about a DVD that I made called Abolish the Federal Reserve. Please, like 74 minutes long, Abolish the Federal Reserve. And then number 2, Creating Wars for Profit. That's, I think, 2 hours long. But you're going to learn what I just covered, and some of this probably repeat because it's an amplification of the first one. Then you need to watch third one, Clinton's Clinton's conspiracy. 'Cause
Okay.
Bill Clinton is not a conspiracy theorist. He's a conspiracy realist. He was taught about this conspiracy by Dr. Carol Quigley and the Rhodes Scholarship Program in Oxford for 2 years.
No, look at Quigley. He actually cites Carol Quigley, who was a professor at Georgetown University, as his mentor during, I think it was in his acceptance speech for the Democratic nomination.
And you
anyway,
can read
Ralph, and I'll look into these other things as well. It's very interesting. I consider myself to be somewhat of an armchair student of history, and I appreciate the interview today.
Please be open, Charles. That's all I can suggest.
Will do.
Let's talk even privately. You didn't want to do it on the show if you don't want to. Talk privately. You've got to fill in some gaps, my friend, and I'm urging you to do so. This country is in serious trouble.
I agree with that.
Thank you. Thank you so very much for whatever opportunity you gave me. And if you play this, I hope your listeners will listen and hopefully go to my website, www.ralph-epperson.com, ralph-epperson.com. And if you don't have to buy anything, just browse to see how serious this problem is.
All right, Ralph. Thanks a lot. Talk to you soon.
My pleasure.
All right.